I'll talk about earnings and the labour market and what we learnt yesterday. So by way of introduction, I thought it would be nice to see what the labour market looks like according to Mr. Hammond. So Mr. Hammond said yesterday that employment is at a record high. And indeed, it's impressive. It's almost 75% of working age people in work in the last quarter of last year. Unemployment is at an 11-year low, So it's at 4.9%. Although he didn't say, or what we should say is that it is set to rise to 5.2%, which is 120,000 extra people unemployed by 2019. And point number 3, real wages have grown for 27 straight months. Now, when I divided that by 12 last night, I got 2 years and a quarter. And really, it's not that impressive, given that real median earnings in 2015-16 were still almost 7% below their pre-recession level. So what have we learned? Well, we didn't see any large changes to forecast employment or average earnings. But there was an interesting and important commentary by the OBR on the earnings distribution that I'm going to talk you through and what its importance is. So looking at the earnings of an employee in the middle of the earnings distribution, the median. So after adjusting for inflation, their earnings have fallen from about £24,200 a year in 2007-8 to £22,600 by 2015-16, which is £1,600 lower. The OBR then forecasts some modest increases in earnings over the forecast period so that we're roughly getting back to the pre-recession level by 21-22. Now, in order to compare this to other measures of earnings, I'm going to index this measure to 100 in 2007-8 and compare some other measures. So that's what I just did there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the earnings at the 99th percentile of the earnings distribution. So this is the person who earns more than 99% of employees. And let's see how it's changed since 2007-8. So what we see here is that for these top earners, earnings have fallen considerably faster than at the median. That's a total fall of 12% since 2007-8. And now, the OBR said in its EFO yesterday that they expect the top 10% of earners to grow marginally slower than the average by just a small amount, by 0.25% per annum for 4 years from 2018-19 onwards. And that was explicitly because they believe that this group are going to disproportionately be hit by the effects of leaving the European Union. So if we put the forecast in there in dotted lines, we see that this will be, again, recovering at a modest rate to leave earnings for this group 7% lower in real terms than their pre-crisis levels. Now, it's important to remember these aren't the only changes going on in the earnings distribution. There's this thing called the national living wage. And the national living wage is set to increase both relative to prices and relative to earnings over the next few years. This here shows what the OBR is forecasting for that path. It's also, while this is going to boost the earnings of people towards the bottom of the earnings distribution, it's important to point out that this comes at some cost. The OBR says that this will increase unemployment. It's roughly half of the increase in unemployment we expect over the next few years. The OBR is kind of assigning to the increase in the national living wage. And there really is only so far, we don't know how far you can push this before you get it, much more substantial amounts of unemployment. We're still uncertain about what its effect will be. So I should say, how much has this changed compared to November? Well, not very much. But it is worth pointing out that compared to this time a year ago, earnings forecasts for the median and the national living wage, they didn't tell us about anything about the top last time, are considerably lower than this time last year. So I think the really key thing to draw out here is what is going on top earners, and I'm going to focus on them now. So who are top earners? Well, compared to employees on average, those in the top 1% of earnings are potentially unsurprisingly 4 times more likely than average to work in finance, twice as likely than average to live in London, work in London and the South East, and the vast majority of them are men. So why am I telling you this, and why should you care? Well, high earners are really important to the Exchequer because they account for a very large share of tax revenue. So an individual earning at the 99th percentile earns 4.6 times that at the median. But he, and it's disproportionately he, pays over 8 times the amount of income tax and national insurance. These kind of people are also going to pay much larger amounts in capital taxes than the vast majority of people. And the important thing here is that great uncertainty in earnings at the top of the distribution leads to even greater uncertainty over forecasts in tax revenues over the coming period. The other thing we should point out is that these particularly large falls at the top of the earnings distribution have a large effect on measures of earnings inequality. So in this graph here, that is not what I expected, but for those with eagle eyes, they might. I'm going to draw it with a little. Okay, so this is the ratio of earnings at the 99th percentile to the median. And you can see from 1997, it rose from about under 4.4 times up to reach about 5 times in about 2011, since when it has fallen significantly. And this measure of earnings inequality, that between the very top and the middle of the earnings distribution, is now back to its level around that it reached around the millennium. So what are the conclusions from this? So we've had little change from the overall OBR labour market forecast, but this particularly poor growth in earnings for the highest earners, which the OBR has highlighted and wrote in quite an extensive box, really is quite important. And going forward, we think that this might be important because these groups are going to be potentially disproportionately hit by the UK exiting the EU and leading to more uncertainty into tax revenue forecasts. The last thing I'll say is that this is all about earnings, but that feeds in to slow growth, the coming slow growth in earnings feeds in to slow growth in households' average living standards. So recent projections by my colleagues imply that there's going to be only modest growth, even if earnings perform better than expected. So this here is a chart from my colleague's work published very recently. And what you can see here is that this dark line is the outturn for median household income over the last 50 or so years and into the future. And what you can see is that median income is going to have grown since the recession by the time we get to the end of the forecast period by coming up to about 10%. But it's considerably lower than we might have expected had income growth continued at its pre-recession rate, as is shown by the light line here. And now, that's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Andy to talk about, well, whatever we've got left to say.